And so, Paul, tell us about Star Wars
Yeah.
Rebels: A Decade On.
Well, much like the Clone Wars, this was brought to us in a very sort of, I mean, this was the first Disney product, basically. Before we had any films, this is what they launched Disney's involvement with Star Wars with was Rebels. And I don't think there's any accident that the first episode of Rebels, which introduced us primarily to the character of Ezra Bridger, um, very much felt like the opening to Aladdin. You got this street rat, if you like, if that's what you want to call him, trying to survive by taking the odd bit of food and running around, running away from people. Um, but yeah, like Mark said there, it evolved and it grew with its audience, which much the same as you got with like the Harry Potter novels, where they start off aimed at a certain demographic and they grow with that demographic as they mature, which is a really nice way of keeping your audience. Um, so yeah, it started off quite light. By the end of it, things got pretty dark. And without it, we wouldn't have perhaps evolved into the Disney show Ahsoka, because Ahsoka is essentially live action Rebels spin-off. I think there were 4 seasons of Rebels eventually. So Ahsoka is effectively Rebels season 5. Um, but yeah, I like the characterization. It was a new kind of style for the Star Wars animation. Very Disney in its look. Um, but it did take some risks along the way. I mean, they blinded one of the main characters. Um, and there were things, yeah, Star Wars Rebels was something that a lot of people enjoyed at the time. And again, for many of the people that we now see at conventions who will be perhaps in their early 20s, it was probably their joining point. You know, they probably saw that on Disney XD or whatever whatever channel they watched it on, and that might have been their entry point to Star Wars. We see it all the time when we go to conventions, bro, all over the world that people will dress up. I mean, we were there the one year and there was a whole family dressed up as the main 6 characters from the Ghost crew, and they got up on stage and really good costumes. But it's something that I don't think at the time I appreciated the significance of it. Um, but then when I've rewatched it over the years, um, and then we've been reintroduced to the characters in live action, I suppose what that does for me, once you turn something that's either been primarily come from a book or from a video game or from animation, once it becomes live action, that to me is when it becomes canon. I'm not one for really thinking of animation as canon in its own right. But once you start linking up all the dots, joining all the dots, then for me, for some reason, it resonates. So yeah, so I can now go back and watch Rebels differently than when I watched it the first time around.
I think, if I remember right, it got criticised a lot at its launch because, in the harshest possible way, its production values were less than the Clone Wars.
Yeah.
The Clone Wars, incredibly high production values, but that was part of the reason why it was cancelled. It was incredibly expensive to make.
Mm.
Rebels was a more financial viable um, level of animation. And so it had a very different look from what people were used to in terms of Star Wars animation at the time when it debuted. But I think it grew to people appreciate it in itself as its own design. And obviously, since then, you've mentioned Ahsoka, but you had things like the Bad Batch as well. So it's kind of um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
evolved to have its own kind of sequels in different ways. Um, which kind of brought me to ask a question: what's next for Star Wars animation? Um, is it a continuation of the Rebels storyline, or should they um, be evolving into something completely new again?
What would you like to see? Because I know what I would like to see. So Where would you
Um,
like it to go?
I'm kind of all for them starting something new.
Yeah. I'd like to see them use it for an opportunity to perhaps do an animated version of the Thrawn trilogy, so Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, etc. Or to do some sort of animation set between either Star Wars and Empire or Empire and Jedi, or just after Jedi, but featuring the key characters that we grew up with. Um, I don't think that's a cop out in any way, shape, or form. I think it would be a really nice way to reintroduce those characters using different voice actors, um, and finally be able to escape from this seemingly difficult task of recasting those characters. I
Yeah,
think if you can recast it in animation, then you make the brave step and start recasting for live action. But I'd love to see more adventures of Han, Luke, Chewie, and everybody else.
yeah.
Um,
Art by Din on
that
X.
would be what I would like to see.
Yeah, Art by Din on X has suggested an Omega show. Um, Mr. Newbold has suggested season 2 of The Acolyte. There's a potential as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
That's a good point.
there's lots of
Yeah,
scope. I'm kind of surprised that there's not something already announced. But I guess we've got Celebration Japan on the horizon that would be a
yeah,
nice launch pad for something.
yeah,
Um, Disney Plus is screaming out for content. Animation seems a no-brainer way to go. I'm presuming with it being animation, there's lots of things that are years in the pipeline that there's potentially a number of shows um, coming down the track already. Um, and some of them could be Rebel sequels, some of them could be something entirely different.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's probably things that they're already working on that they haven't announced yet. They've certainly done that in the past.
Yep, Jonathan
Um,
Tyson there sort of agreed with you in suggesting the Heir of the Emperor as well.
yeah, yeah. Or maybe even some of the books that have now gone into legends. So Tales from the Cantina, things like that. Things real deep cuts for the fans
Yeah,
that aren't going to.
I kind of um, like the way that Star Wars Visions each episode was its own thing.
I
I
liked
kind
it.
of think
Yeah,
like your idea, the Tales from the Cantina, Tales from the Bounty Hunters, Tales from Jabba's Palace, that kind of novels
yeah,
where you could have a different bunch of characters a week,
yeah,
um, could be really interesting. I guess that's expensive because you're creating new assets all the time, but it's then a jumping point for what episodes stuck with the fandom,
yeah.
and then you spin that off into its own series. So if a particular group of characters
Exactly, exactly.
catch on,
Yeah, yeah. That's exactly what you do, isn't it?
yeah,
I mean, when Captain Rex took off in a big way in the Clone Wars, it was a bit of a no-brainer to introduce him into Rebels,
yeah.
and that links the two series together as well.
You kind of think with it being Celebration Japan next year as well, there is kind of idea of been doing more than the manga style with Star Wars Visions,
Yeah.
that launching to do a whole series in the manga style based around the same set of characters from one studio instead of individual episodes might be something that would make sense for them to announce in that marketplace as well.
Yeah, yeah. It is a really good way of sort of testing the market, seeing what people really go with, and then just yeah. That's a good point there, Mark. Yeah. Um, but it's an opportunity to do something reasonably inexpensive. I know there's still quite a bit of money attached to it, but it can't be anywhere near as risky as sort of committing to a trilogy or a big series like The Acolyte was.
Yeah.
So that yeah, it just makes sense.
10 years on from Star Wars Rebels, does it feel like 10 years? Does it,
It, it,
have the characters
yeah,
resonated over that time period for you?
it kind of feels longer in a way. I think the characters probably wouldn't have stayed with me had they not been reintroduced in Ahsoka in such a way. Um, and obviously we've seen Zeb as well in The Mandalorian. So you again, you can join all the dots. You can pull the crew together, and you could see them doing some sort of proper Rebels TV series at some point. But
And,
do they really need to? Ahsoka is essentially Rebels anyway.
and that I guess that's the kind of benefit they've got. With Star Wars Rebels, so many people have grown up with it. You've now got the potential to carry it on in animation form or live action form.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
they've got a huge potential to tap in there still.
I think as well because it started off as an animation and was so well received. If they did suddenly flip it and go back to animation, people probably wouldn't complain at all because they're already familiar with it in that style.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
So, an interesting decade. Star Wars Rebels giving us an interesting group of characters.
Yeah,
Lots of potential from the future, whether it comes from Star Wars Rebels itself or other aspects within the Star Wars franchise as well.
mm.
So, definitely, I think feel it's fair to say Star Wars Rebels has been something very successful for
Yeah,
Lucasfilm.
yeah. I don't think there's many people that have. I don't think there's been any sort of big negative campaign against it at any point. I think it's always been reasonably well received. And yeah, long may it live in whatever format.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jabba's Court's part of Good Morning Tatooine, your weekly recap of all your Star Wars news, live streaming every Sunday, 9 p.m. in the UK, 4 p.m. in New York. And it's also released as its own video every Wednesday at 7 p.m.